Okay, so we'll talk of pattern thinking. First, why patterns? I mean, why I came to patterns. Actually, I was looking for, some years ago, strategies, examining strategies that could help federate disparate action and thinking and try to coalesce a bit the different forms of agency towards, if not totally shared, but at least going in similar directions of regenerative systems and caring about a certain number of things. And the first thing that I examined actually was something that is, let's say, quite widespread, which is narrative, and what type of narrative or what type of value or could help create an overarching narrative. And that needed to be quite ambiguous, fuzzy, not very clear, blur, so that in order to bring together things that are not exactly matching. And so I started to think that, well, maybe the commons narrative could be something interesting, because commons is something that we want to nurture and to grow and to collectively regenerate. And commons take different shapes. There's a very structured shape in the commons movement, but there's also lots of things that could be connected to the commons. So I tried with this, and I realized that even in the commons movement, there couldn't be an agreement on what a very broad, overarching definition of the commons would be, because there were different interests, and there was also a big dichotomy between what is like technically and legally a commons and what is more generally and fuzzily a commons, and there was a fear that the very strong notion of the commons would be diluted in too many different things. So that was out for the narrative. And so then I thought, well, if you can't go from higher up, you can go from something more immanent and contained into the different topics, and more, say, technological, that, let's say, more language-like as a technology, rather than as a discourse. And that's when I thought that patterns would be a very good way to bring together different things, because I have the conviction that with patterns you can connect different dimensions of reality or of complexity, that you can connect different ways of perceiving them, interpreting them, and communicating about them, and different ways of formalizing them and exchanging about them. So what we're going to do today, we're going to construct a group understanding of what patterns are, what patterns are involved in, and what pattern thinking may be useful for. I think we had lots of little hints during the previous days. We talked about interfacing different areas. We talked about the brain. We talked about social construction. I mean, we talked about all kinds of things. So then we will, I will provide a few highlights or a few things for thought, food for thought. And then we'll study a burning question and use some pattern thinking to study a burning question. So the first exercise, basically, you will use post-its, write words, nouns, verbs, short, maybe sentences, but not too many ideas. One idea per post-it. And we will, even if it's a idea of multiplicity, and you will, as you finish, put it somewhere on the napkin, I mean on the tablecloth, and try to put it in a place which has some sense of next to something that is more or less connected. And once everything is on the here, we will take time to reorganize and revisit the clustering and discuss the clustering and see what the gaps are. So that will take about 20 minutes or 15 to 20 minutes. Then I'll do my highlights and we can...
What are we supposed to...
So you are supposed to write one idea per post-it on what a pattern is, what it is involved in, and what pattern thinking may be useful for, to build an understanding of pattern thinking, basically, and what it does, what we could do with it.
All on the same post-it?
No, one idea.
No.
Different?
Yeah, one idea per post-it, and then we'll cluster them, and we'll try and create some form of understanding. But it's more about discussing what you all have put there, and grouping them, and discussing the associations and connections, and things like that. So you can write as many as you want.
The question, what is pattern thinking? Yeah? Yeah?
The question
Okay, what is a pattern? Okay.
What is a pattern?
Okay, yeah, question.
What are patterns involved in, which I think is a very important question, to then say what pattern thinking is and how we use the patterns, basically. I mean, how do you go from the patterns to the pattern thinking?
Could you please elaborate a little bit this question? What are patterns involved in?
Where do you find them? I mean, we have them in the brain, we have them in artificial intelligence, we have them in carpets, Lots of this. No, but yes.
You do so well. Carpets. Okay, now I have another one.
Done, right?
It was impressive.
Go.
I'm surprised actually that Christopher Alexander himself, talks about patterns in carpets, which I personally have nothing to do with.
But there is a...
Yes, but no. Yes, but no. Ah, you see? So maybe when you put it on the thing, you speak it out loud and you stick it, kind of.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Or maybe not too much.
Repeated forms of spaces.
Can you speak them out loud?
Redundance.
Now, when we put it?
I think so.
So I wrote discovering regulations and perception.
I said what is not randomness.
What is that?
A pattern is what is not randomness. What is not randomness.
Oh, randomness.
It's the same as to say
Okay.
it's redundant.
What do you mean by the second question?
What are patterns involved in?
Yeah, I mean, what?
Well, you talked of patterns in, what you observe, and Hoop, I have a pattern, and you talked of patterns of psychology, and you talked of patterns in the brain, and Saifan talked of patterns of emergence. So that's where patterns are involved in.
So in which disciplines? Or in which disciplines or?
Patterns are involved in...
Anything that you understand pattern being involved in. I mean, I don't want to narrow. It's an open question.
Maybe we are involved in patterns.
Maybe.
I wrote patterns are involved in beauty.
I wrote
You are part of math. Is it for
I wrote pattern from structure and pattern from behavior.
No,
The second
don't do it.
question,
But
What
it can
are
be
the
also,
other
it
your
can be
day?
a discipline, but it
Yes.
can be, Rolf, it can be a discipline, but it can also be behavior or, where do you find, oh, okay, I formulate it differently. Where do you find patterns?
Everywhere.
Huh?
Everywhere.
Okay, anywhere.
Just write it down.
Of course.
Sorry, so mine was repeated non-random response to stimuli, or to stimuli, for, what is it? What is it good for? I said it's good for understanding complex systems and good for reducing risk, and then patterns are involved in everything.
I'm worried of psychoanalytic move today. I'm freely associating. God is a pattern, given security.
God is a
Pattern.
God is a pattern.
So at the end, for the
Isn't he
last
wave? Last time that made sense.
Is a wave not a pattern?
5 minutes or so, we're going to make
Very
a
good.
kind of a synthesis of
I wrote pattern is something perceived in a mass, and the thinking equals pattern thinking.
Math or math?
Mass.
E or A?
E. I have something emerging from something complex and or unorganized, and then repetition.
I just put pattern as an ordered repetition.
Can I have?
So for example, I just read Cadell and Gael, your paper, and I thought I was seeing patterns all over the place. Now I'm joking, but not so joking.
So were you joking or were you not joking?
Well, all over the place, I'm joking, but I
Right,
saw
you're
some...
both at the same time and the
Exactly,
contradiction is
at
just
the
letting
same
itself be
time.
in.
Now the question is what will be the same.
Dialectic thinking, what is the other of pattern? If I read over.
Right.
I have
Yeah,
patterns
yeah.
are what
is
we
the-
make
exactly.
of
That is
things.
that is a good question.
Everything is pattern.
The make of things?
Right. Non-being.
Pattern is repetitive proportion.
Could there be a pattern in non-being? Emergent pattern? Are they nothing from something?
I'm gonna
Non-pattern,
have
maybe
to have another
non-pattern.
coffee before I put my philosophy hat back on and
So
then,
yeah, it's interesting that you share because it gives you
And
better ideas.
then we'll go.
So we can do that for a couple of minutes more, 2-3 minutes. If you want to draw things, you can draw things. But make sure that you have on the 3, you have responded a couple of things on the 3 different questions. Because, or anyway, you have to, at some point, provide answers to the 3 questions. That can be very broad answers, I mean, looking
Patterns
for
can
ambiguous and fuzzy, right?
Can be what? I had a question back on what? Say something.
Can reveal underlying organization.
How patterns are built? It's a question.
Okay, well,
How
it's-
patterns
Are
are
built or created or imagined or...
well, that could be what pattern thinking is. Yeah. Next question.
It's a result of interaction between internal and external.
The interpenetration.
A guide to approach the unknown.
What did you find the photo?
What did you say?
A guide to approach the
With
unknown.
the stuff down in the back.
I love juggling corals. Oh my goodness.
What is pattern thinking good for pattern recognition, repetition recognition, for pattern communication, and for design?
Patterns are involved in the development of the brain.
I want to reply to say patterns can structure emergent organization.
I have a pattern as an observational structure that, and I had to think of the re-entry, the structure re-entries, something then can be called a system or something, but it's always observational. so it's not there, I would say.
Did you write it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also said that pattern thinking is not useful, it is just the way we are built.
Yeah. Pero it's useful
From
to
Freud,
to feel more safe.
Yeah, pattern
Synthesize
thinking,
those two.
core thinking, yeah.
Okay, you think you have enough to work with? Okay.
I'll respond to Ioana. Patterns for feeling trapped. Where's the? There you go.
Yeah.
See, we already have
Somehow
pattern
this
here.
shows our level.
You see, Helen, we already
I
have
like this
pattern.
one.
We don't need to change.
Someone else.
The brains are there.
That's good. So now, I propose that you construct the group understanding, because here is a individual understanding. So you're going to, not probably have a whole conversation with everybody and all the post-its, but maybe 2 or 3, and start clustering.
Which do you?
No, well, you start clustering, and then you'll naturally form groups around clusters, I suppose, of 2, 3, 4 people, and so you can together create a clustering that is a little bit more ordered than this, and then, what happened here? Yeah. When I look at it, it's back. When I turn my head, it stops.
It's a pattern. It's quantum.
So the idea is to synthesize the group understanding, but or to map the group understanding rather than synthesize. So to try and see how this works together, and if we can answer the questions. And then we'll wrap up for 5 minutes, try and look and put it on the board.
So if you agree, I can read the post-it and you tell me where I can put them.
Yeah, but I prefer that you're all there and
So
physically.
Yeah, but okay.
That you
Like
take,
to move,
you
but let's
compare.
not be lazy.
Okay, so
That you
let's go.
compare. That and then you
Everything that is connected to art or design is here.
Okay, so here you are.
That was the
I have patterns.
There was
from
this
sense.
beauty thing.
Patterns
As a
are
common sense.
involved in the evolution
I have
of concept.
repetition here.
Repetition.
Okay, you can
Here
make
there
mine
is
discover
personal
regulation.
everything. Here. Pattern is involved in the development.
Design, art, beauty to hear.
But beauty is also in nature, so it should be somewhere in between. I suppose.
So, where is it?
In the art
This
and
is
but
camera woman.
You have something where organization.
upside down.
Something emerging from something else.
Yeah, emergent organization.
Okay.
What is
NSK?
Good for reducing risk. Oh, sorry, I thought it was an N. So we have security. Montel models. Do we have a place for?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Repeat the first of spaces. Good for understanding complex
This is
systems. And the proportion.
Proportion, yes.
Self-realization. This is more what it is about, reducing uncertainty.
Who was everywhere? Kind of
Yeah,
everywhere.
here. Everything, but
Everything.
everything is
Everything.
Yes, everything is everywhere. Repeated response.
Patterns are one.
And what we make of
What repeated response has to do?
good for collaboration and co-thinking. It's like
thinking communication.
human nature.
Communication.
Adapt to preserve.
So where is
How
my
we do yours, yes. And how we behavior. From sorry. Yeah,
Manual
yes, so
process.
it's like
Not
the behavior. But it's from part of
I
our
put
web
the first in
from
the middle, perception.
it's emerging. And here it's so maybe you have something about emerging. Here, here emerging. So this is how it comes about, and then you reveal not randomness as like organization.
And this interaction between external
I think
and internal.
you manipulate patterns every day.
I do, I'm just wondering.
Here is trying to find
Yeah.
Patterns of this?
But they,
Yeah, I'm watching from the outside. It's
Okay.
more helpful, I think.
This is interaction.
I mean, if you have something to say about
I think
this,
maybe we
yeah.
can work or not.
Yeah, I mean, about the third question, I'm not sure what you mean by pattern thinking. Because, I mean, this is what we are trying to find out about the other question.
Well, it's something that
In your
was made,
design,
I mean, it's something that doesn't really exist as a
So you relate.
practice,
It's
right?
organization?
Pattern thinking. Or it's more or less, you know, you see
Where's
it more in like
organization?
autistic type
Organization
of
here.
psychology. That's where I found it the most. But
Okay,
to
so
us,
here is
maybe
everybody
I mean, it's something that I'm doing,
Where's
I
the
can say
nature?
that I'm doing a
cluster.
No nature.
there was no nature one. I thought there
We
was
need
nature
to.
one.
Have you?
Here we have the cluster of design, beauty, art.
Okay.
This is
Okay.
this cluster.
Here
And
is the cluster
human
And
psychology.
it is connected to the human psychology also.
Also here we have some kind of human
So let's link it. Let's
becoming.
Okay, so let's.
Maybe we can draw and make.
Yeah, you can take.
We can connect it. We don't have to
What,
move it, but we
okay,
can
I
connect
read
it.
you what I have. Yeah,
Yeah,
Or we
but
can
if
connect
you
it.
don't want stuff
Maybe we
to.
can like
No, but
connect it.
let's
Why not
understand
move
if
it
you connect it or not. What do you have?
Yeah.
It's useful to feel more safe, patterns for feeling trapped. It is non-useful. It is how we are built. Patterns are all the way we do things.
Okay, and here there is patterns are involved in the evolution of ourselves. Patterns are involved in the development of the brain. Useful to cognize. Can be mental models. Are involved in understanding an interaction between internal and external.
So maybe
Maybe
we
it
can.
can be.
They are not one group, but maybe if we
Maybe
draw,
they are
we can
Yeah,
draw
but
like this and then an
Yeah,
arrow
but
to
the
this.
thing is that isn't it nicer to bring them together so we don't have arrows all over the place and spaghetti?
We'll create.
I don't know, maybe. It will be nice. So connector here.
And a cluster here.
No, they are all together.
Well, we can re-interrogate the pairings because
Okay,
to me, understanding and internal, external are connected, but the development of the brain is more focused. Am I doing the work?
Lama lo.
Okay, but can you interrogate the links and
Nice. Okay, this is very much related to this. And the mental one there. Connected.
Okay.
then
So which other groups do we have? Which other clusters there are?
are you asking me? But you're meant to do the
I did. My cluster.
So this one, I know what it's initiated
No, but
with.
you're meant to work on clusters 2-3 people, but then discuss together.
But we are not. So,
You're not.
so that's why we need to do something else with that.
Okay.
So I'm trying to describe this one,
Yeah.
which is about repetition. We started with that, but we have also systems, redundance, patterns as
Re-entry.
Okay, that's what
Observational.
And then we have discover regulation or
Discover and regularity.
Regularity. That's this one.
And repetition.
And repetition.
Repetition is repeated 3 times. So I think it's
So it's one of the.
Maybe we
It's
could
inherent in the concept.
Yeah.
So
But
that is
at
more
least
like a,
the
like a
repetition,
descriptive
it's all
thing of what
together, or
happens.
they
Yes.
spread
Synonymous.
somewhere
So
else?
what's here?
And here we have the things that are connected to perception. Pattern is this thing called perception, different scales of perception, ordered repetition, again, repeated non-random response,
So maybe
again
let's move
repetition.
it here.
So this
Yeah,
is
don't we
repetition.
see a pattern of pattern in the brain, and then pattern of understanding or internal, external, and then the system is more of an external. I mean, all the projection inside of the external thing that's meant to be external. So, and then there's a emanation. I mean, the beauty and the design stuff is a different thing.
Why beauty?
May I say something? Because actually for me it's kind of insight here. That it's interesting that if we see something what repeats, and it could be connected with beauty, that the mind may perceive something what repeats. I was thinking about alleys here in Paris, and there are these trees where, and then I say, wow, you know, it's like the brain relaxed and it's in awe. Yeah, so that for me it's very, very interesting. I've never seen this way, but there is something in pattern what brain or mind likes. I would say that's this kind of the perception of beauty, and it's surprising. That surprised me. It's just discovery because.
But it's interesting to make this connection. Can you write it? Can you write it on the post-it? Something in the.
Just write what you mean. I don't know.
Well, you said something.
Hey, it's written beauty here, maybe.
It is
Yeah,
written.
but
just move it and then.
The thing you said, there's something
Comforting
in the
mind.
pattern that is. You said something good.
Comforting,
Comforting.
that pleases your mind.
Yes, something good. If there is a particular pattern, but pattern is there, it makes mind relax and also be
Aesthetically
aesthetic.
pleased.
It is the aesthetic. This aesthetic.
Yeah, maybe there is something like pattern are comfortable
Oh, that's it.
because
Well,
we are used to, and it is something we know. So there are
So where do we
there's
put
comfort and reduce anxiety and beauty.
I would put it between beauty and this internal psychological.
Yeah.
But there's also a little cluster on reduce anxiety.
It's one like
No, yes, but
it's
I mean,
one
Yeah,
side
there is
of
one
it.
side.
Like as always.
So for
You can say the
example-
opposite and like we will.
no, I mean,
I'm not sure about
patterns can
the
be
goals
really
in this cluster.
So
Okay.
Christopher Alexander was one guy who coined the
Difficult.
term
The
pattern
trapping.
language, and he was an architect, and he has associated patterns to beauty,
of course, yes, beauty.
but also to something that he called a quality without a name, which is probably connected to this comfortable, like the brain feels nice and feels good. So it was at the foundation of his, big
Maybe it's
theory.
a level of predictability to it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So that is comforting to the.
Yeah.
Yeah, because on the other hand, you have what Cadell said, that there is trap, there is something what is, makes you feel relaxed, whereas maybe.
But does it mean that pattern can be against creativity or innovation? Because we are.
Yeah.
So there's a Janus, or how do you say, a
Double face or
double-faced. So level of predictability. Where does this go? Repetition.
Repetition.
Yeah.
Where?
I will.
And we have this tendency to call people
against innovation.
generating patterns in things we don't see insane.
Again.
We call people who see patterns in things where we don't see patterns insane.
Yes. The
fragmented
So pattern recognizing is a form of group conditioning.
It's very interesting that we perceive things in a similar way, and then we feel, we are okay. It's okay.
Well, how about the connection between patterns and plasticity then? Because plastic is something, I read some of the Malabu books, is that plastic can be, something that you mold, but it stays in the form of the mold, but it's also something that can be reshaped. And depending on the matter or how the thing is worked, it can stay in the shape and never move and be in a kind of frozen condition, or be malleable and change its shape. And pattern is probably typically, or pattern thinking typically, this type of stuff, where the pattern is at the same time what, puts you into some normative thing, or if you use it differently.
There's a level of momentum to it, so once it's there, the probability that it will stay there is increased a little bit. So the next states, the possible next states are limited. Because it's there, there is a momentum, it tends to gain momentum.
Yeah, but it depends if you talk about patterns in the...
Then that has guess.
If you talk about...
My line of thought is that if it's there, then everything in the environment will take into account that it's already there, will adapt its behavior to that, and then it will stay.
So it's like the dog in the picture yesterday.
Yeah, but that's
once
the adoption of the pattern. But once you know the pattern, what happens? Maybe you can change it. Maybe that's pattern thinking. Is that you're trapped into a pattern because maybe you don't know the pattern, or the economy is trapped in a pattern because you can't put your finger on what's going on, and
okay, but this is an important point. Let's find him a place on the
momentum. Yeah.
If we think about biological life, it's all about pattern.
I think it's about
without pattern, there will be no system or no biological life. No, cells cannot live without patterns.
Yeah.
Patterns is communication, because everything in biology...
We already have.
It's already there.
It's already there. It's already there?
Yeah.
Pattern is
But
communication?
Yeah.
I thought it was...
Okay, so now let's...
Get back with your feet on the ground.
You try to answer the 3 questions.
And if patterns are like biology, or biology is all about pattern, then the pattern thinking allows us to intervene.
Oh, okay.
And then we can change. Because once you observe a pattern, you can also intervene.
Patterns may connect also different scales.
That's also.
And the question is how a pattern can evolve regarding the change of the society, culture, and so on. Because we have patterns at a specific moment, but how can they change with the evolution of society, knowledge, or something like that? Are they fixed or not?
Patterns can draw.
So there is already the evolution of patterns?
No, please. Thank you.
I would like to add the word kaleidoscope. What? Kaleidoscope, like it's a lot of chaotic little elements, but one twist of the turn you see new patterns, one twist of the turn you see new patterns, and there's not like a true pattern, but many possibilities.
I think patterns are also about power. So you call it comfort, but when I think about politics or ideology, fascism, for example, is the way we organize ourselves into a march.
Get in line.
Get in line.
Yeah.
So how can
That's where you get it.
how can we maybe synthesize or make one round of
My suggestion would be to park these 3 original questions and to see how the new clustering, what the names are of these new groups, and to name that.
Okay, so take 5 minutes to do that.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. There's talking, there's asking, there's movement, going on your knees, writing, interactivity.
I'm just reading here that a patternist is defined as someone who views patterns of information as the fundamental reality.
Again.
Patternist?
A patternist?
Wow.
A patternist. So it's even a religious ideology now.
There is the alienist. pattern is.
So yeah, so now, yeah, try to connect the
There is nothing beyond the
clusters.
patterns of information.
So Ralph, what did you see from your observation that went external to?
I think we can reduce it to one single step, and this is repetition, and everything else we discussed is just assigning something. But if you look at the mere pattern, then it's just a repetition of anything. And the next idea is then which is the most promising pattern to find. So which are helpful and which are not helpful.
May I ask a question which isn't about grouping? Like, what does the mind do when it sees non-pattern?
What do you mean by seeing non-pattern? Because sight is also
noise.
So, like, in that sense, like, we are talking about everything. But, like, if we are talking about something, my question is there, like, not that?
There are, some experiments where you take students and then they hear like a noise which are without pattern, or they are seeing images which are random. After 5 minutes, they begin to see patterns that do not exist.
So they create a pattern.
Inventing patterns, because otherwise you go crazy. So you start to see patterns in the...
Or doesn't your brain just immediately dismiss it? Like, if you're trying to listen to someone that's speaking a language you don't understand, your brain's not recognizing those patterns, so you just immediately dismiss.
It's not random.
But it's random to you.
No, it's not random. I don't think so.
If someone speaks a language you've never heard before,
well, but that already classifies it. This is an unknown language, so it doesn't drive you crazy. You just say, I don't know the language.
Right, that's what I meant by, like, you dismiss it immediately. Make meaning of it.
They put you and there is a noise which is, by definition, random. But then you begin to hear something which is coherent.
But I hear patterns in foreign languages, no?
Yeah.
It's the same in meditation. When you meditate for a longer time, the intensity grows so unbearable partly that people start to create angels, hear voices, see light and colors, etc. Yeah, it's induced insanity.
There's a good YouTube documentary series called Mindfield, where in the first episode the creator of this series puts himself in a white room for like a week or something like that. So there's no pattern technically, it's just a white room. And he basically goes insane. Like and he's just trapped in his own hallucinations basically, like, but the mind, like, because there's no external stimulus basically, so the mind sort of just starts generating its own hallucinations, I suppose.
Yeah, but the thing is now there is
a small difference.
Sorry? The most interesting thing was that it was his like perception of time. Like, he totally lost all perception of time, and it did when he got out of the white room. It did take him like a few hours before he was back to his normal self. But like, yeah, he was really disoriented for a while.
I think it's interesting. I don't know the answer, but there is a difference between non-pattern, like white room, and randomness.
Right.
Where you see where you go and then you see something which is by definition, and then the impact on the brain and on the mind can be different.
Right.
But
I think this randomness is more and can create.
Randomness is like chaos.
In the beginning it's going to be more create more anxiety, randomness, but then you will begin to see the patterns. In a non-patterned room.
The question is if you have only patterns, so random patterns you perceive but nothing else, so no other external orientation, if then the same would happen. I think so.
Consider the idea of the school. It's about complexity and confusion also. The more people are capable and resilient to work with the complexity, the more creative they can work with new patterns and higher intensity. You know, like in meditation, when you learn to work with this hurt and pain and everything, what's going on there, you become more creative and more focused and more centered. So it's about beauty, but the bad thing about pattern recognition or not having any patterns can deliver a new function for us to become more creative. Yeah, but I think we need society for this. When you do this alone, you have the problem. Everyone else thinks you mad. Yeah. So.
Yeah, but I would say that you need to stay with it, because
Yeah,
I think my original answer for your question is that something happens to me when when I'm facing something what is chaotic. Well, it's emotional experience. First of all, I feel like, well, what's going on? So it takes a while. And I think that there could be a tendency to avoid it, not to be in touch with it, to say, oh, I have nothing to do with that, or I don't understand. It's not me who is to understand it, so things like that. So, but if you stay long enough, then something may emerge. But if it emerges, then you are, quiet again. Then I think that's.
So it's about the quality to dimensionate and to differentiate. Both, yeah, to create new dimensions for perspectives and to resolve them, yeah, to create a higher resolution, and thus they are evolving new patterns. So
can you wrap this, and then we'll wrap this session. We'll finish this session.
So the equilibrium would be that you settle in a pattern. As long as it isn't there, you feel kind of anxious or don't want that. And as soon as you've produced it or noticed it or it has appeared, you kind of.
The question is for how long? Because then there is a process. So maybe if you are there long enough, you are bored. And
I think also that we are very multi-layered systems, so not necessarily the whole of you relax in the pattern. There might be an aspect of you that relaxes within the pattern, and you are, freed to be busy with something else. So if you stroll in the street and you have a certain kind of repetitive symmetry, it creates a more silent, I don't know, part of you is busy with this, so the rest can daydream.
Not necessarily. No, because if it's the street in for example, I remember the one of the biggest cities in Albania. When I walk the street, and there is, believe me, no pattern or the patterns are related. And then you are very busy with trying to find yourself in it and do whatever. So I think that's
it's anxious.
Yes, I think that the level of pattern enables you, to go that. Yeah, it could be shopping, but it could be also something what gives you
stroll,
for thinking.
Stroll and think, and this is the beauty of cities. It's to walk and enter this state of serendipity.
So I have here no patterns can lead to confusion. Where shall I put this?
You have organization,
anxiety,
in the
bottom left.
Here?
No, left. No, this is right. Left is right.
Where is the psychological cluster?
I think it's there.
It's here somewhere. This in the middle.
Involved in understanding.
It's about relaxing and feeling trapped. You see this? No, it has.
Can you read it? You feel safe or you feel trapped?
Okay, here. Okay. So patterns can lead to confusion. Confusion can lead to emergent patterns, and emergent patterns can define new creativity. Yeah.
Okay. So, a few. So that was my takeaway, but we kind of touched on some of this, but maybe not in such formulation, but I saw that as another way of looking at our different worlds in their multiple dimensions, whether it's our inner world or the outer world and the intersubjective world, and the different dimensions of reality, complexity. A very important point for me is that it can be a tool for inquiry and probing experience of reality and confronting views. So maybe trying to touch the truth by confronting the reality that comes from different experiences, and then a tool to construct new realities. So it was about having an enhanced embodied cognition, probing, sensing, thinking, acting, acuteness or capacity, that when we're in the confusion and noise, we can develop like new senses, acute senses to try and penetrate the blur or
And then another way of looking as opposed to like what? Because this is, I think, like...
well, the way of looking that is more like the way we think, rather than a logical way of looking at things.
Okay, so another as opposed to what we could imagine that the mind does, if we imagine it very algorithmically and very...
Yeah, I mean, I didn't put too much signification in
but I think it's in that sense important that, like, are you positioning it as like a way of thinking that we are not doing and we should learn, or you are saying, like, you are showing us that thinking is exactly that? It's kind of...
No, I'm saying that if we think more, if we bring to the surface more of the way our brain works and things are assembled in our minds, then maybe we can manage to inquire and decode more of what's going on inside ourselves, outside ourselves, and across us.
Could the relate? Because I'm also asking, like, what is the relation with the systems thinking summer school aim or purpose or whatever it is? That instead of saying we're seeking the truth, is we're working on patterns that we bring about, and then you see, I see this pattern, maybe you see a different pattern, and I'll call you insane, or I'll call you false, or I'll call you stupid. Whereas when you see it as, oh, she has a different pattern, it totally changes the rules of the game.
It emotionalizes the thing, right?
Yeah, and then it becomes more creative. It's not like this is the truth and you adapt to my pattern. But no, this is my pattern. As a scientist, I see this pattern, and as an artist, you see a different pattern, or as a religious person, you see a different pattern. And those dimensions can be more integrated and negotiated, or... I'm just trying. I don't know if this...
In neuroscience... In neuroscience or cognitive science, don't they see our minds as pattern recognition software, basically?
Yeah,
like
that's
you said.
The next.
Right. Okay.
So I'm going a little bit back and reconnect it to what Rolf was and Balthazar were talking about these past days. That apparently the
Can I just very quickly, because I think it relates a lot with moving away from object-oriented orientation towards more like individuation, like scatters and variations, in which there is a contour or some density.
Yeah, and some movement and some dynamic.
Yeah, so it's more towards a process orientation.
Yeah, but I'll get back to it.
All right.
So, just I'm not sure pattern help to our tool to build to create new reality, as you wrote on the previous slide. For me, it's more something which helps to understand new reality, but not to build or to create new reality.
But if you adopt new habits or new logics,
but they are already there. It's after that you have patterns. It's not at the beginning. Patterns become patterns because things change or something like that. So they are not at the beginning of the process. But
I was thinking of the design function of patterns, but that is a discussion that we. Yeah. So, but yeah. So back to a bit of brain and stuff here. Is so exactly like our brain is a pattern recognition circuitry, and I'm surprised to see that in many cases people working in artificial intelligence have a very like right to the point and simple way to describe how the brain works, sometimes more intelligible for people like me than actual neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. So, yeah, so that was Kurzweil and a whole bunch of people. But then there was this work from Hawkins that says that each zone of the neocortex takes care of a specific type of patterns, but they're built the same way, and so they kind of get associated because they're of the same nature. So you can clarify that maybe later on, but because it's and then we bring together these different pieces, so to kind of cognize and recognize bigger patterns, so recognize someone's face, a color, an object, and then make inferences with the shapes that we, or the percepts, because it's not only visual shapes, it can be sounds. So if you see, you hear 3 notes and you know which music piece you're talking about. You see someone's back and an ear and a voice, and you recognize who is in the room. And you elaborate more and more complex forms.
Yeah, it's also a way of learning, conditioning. When like the Pavlovian experiment, it's all about creating pattern and recognizing pattern. So pattern thinking is also about learning. Learning is,
in a way that is at the same time, as we said, at the same time normative and narrowing, or opening up in connecting more synapses if you recognize more patterns. So it's a question of the depth or the training on one specific thing, or the breadth that you may have by making more diverse connections. So the thing I mentioned yesterday was this research about the innate foreknowledges of infants, babies, so forms and their proportions and angles, the idea of quantities and arithmetic relations, objects and the way they move, agents and goal-directed actions, places and distance, direction. And well, there are some senses here that are missing, like sounds, but I guess it's contained in objects or the others. But the important thing here to me is that the different things that are almost like systemic by nature, or and that are assembled in more and more complex structures as we develop, and we make sense of them. I mean, in a recursion feedback loop of sensing and integrating them, and then making more complex structures. And the thing that was interesting to me was that in the discussion of the universal grammar of Noam Chomsky, for example, that says that all humans have a kind of innately embedded capacity for syntax that he connects to natural language, that has been quite controversial. Here you can say that if you go one level lower towards cognition, lower than more basic than natural language, that maybe this universal grammar exists in the sense that it's our capacity to assemble patterns and concepts via the inferences that we make, and to create meanings by assembling these different types of things. So the question mark that I have here is maybe we have an innate language of pattern that we can surface out, which is not a pattern language in the sense of Christopher Alexander, and I don't have time to get into the details, but something that we can work on and develop. So I find we were talking about that when we make the observation and we categorize, we are already conditioned by whether we are a scientist or a physicist or yes, physicist or
Autist or
whatever, artist, or if we are a constructivist or whatever. And this is we can like illustrate this by the way we process information and retain information. So Bernard Stiegler, a French philosopher, has an interesting way of describing the different processes that happen when we retain information. Is that we actually see lots of things or perceive, I mean, are in contact or encounter lots of different things, but we only retain the ones that are salient for us, the ones that speak to us, the one that catch our attention, either because it's a novelty or because we recognize it. And so that I illustrate that, well, you know, the only yellow that we select from all the yellows becomes a blue, and that the secondary retention is what creates our memories and creates the filters through which we are going to continue to retain. So you have a first feedback loop between these two things that we are going to retain and through which we are going to, so the more you experience diversity, the more you're going to see different patterns and retain different patterns that you encounter. And then there's the third level, which is more of a social level, is that, so the first level is an individuation level, and then you have the co-individuation level that through your communications and through the external tracks that you leave in your environment, that contributes also to the whole loop. So I won't get into the details either, but something for thought as well. So another thing here that I want to bring to your attention about...
But this third one was what? Could you please...
The third one...
Cultural artifact.
Oh,
yeah, culture, but it's language, it's the vocabulary that we have, it's the books we write, and it's also the actions that we perform, because they contain a certain...
Okay.
So,
it's like the cultural level becomes
I just got distracted for a while. And
yeah, or it's the memory of the social system, or it's the cognition of the social system with the stigmergetic tracks that you were talking about. So another thing I find very interesting about linking thinking and action, and this Buddha loop means observe, orient, decide, act, and it has been designed, and I hope you can read. It's not very legible, but it's the original drawing of the guy. So John Boyd was a fighter pilot during World War II, and he was fascinated by what happens in the brain when you're at the command of your whatever aircraft, and you have to make sure you don't crash, you don't get into the mountain, you get rid of the MiG behind you, etc., etc., etc. And so he kind of came up with some form of model of situational awareness that brings together a whole series of feedback loops that I find very interesting. So the orientation is the most important here and kind of guides what is you're going to observe, actually what you see. So that talks to what I was telling before. But the interesting thing is that in this orientation, and we, I think, alluded to this the previous days, is that you have your cultural traditions, you have your previous experiences, personal, you have your genetic heritage, you have new information that you may integrate, and then you have some form of prompting or, either analysis or synthesis, but this can happen at many, many different paces and scale. not only when you're in an airplane, and it can happen at more or less levels of the consciousness or subconsciousness. Is that if you're super trained, your fighter pilot is not going to say, oh, let me see, let me crunch all this data. I mean, you just do it when you're a black belt karateka or whatever. You just do it. But then you can bring in some rationalization or some logical thinking and things like that. So I found that was an interesting way to turn. If you look at it from a patterns perspective, it could be interesting if you want to more consciously analyze what's going on. Look at it from this perspective. So here I have the interpretation of John Sowa, who is a computer scientist and ontologist and knowledge management guy, who has interpreted Charles Peirce's pragmatic cycle, connecting cognition to action. And so here we can see where the patterns can be and what they connect is that you can imagine that you have patterns in the world, here that you sense, you discover, you learn about through induction. So that's maybe another way of looking at the induction, deduction, abduction that maybe we're not going to discuss because it's one way of probably of seeing it. And then you kind of store your observations. So going back to the previous thing, what you retain basically in your cognitive memory. And from there you can make abductions, guessing, analogies, imagination that springs from your mind, and create theories from it or formalizations from it. So you go from patterns in the world with patterns that are clues, more or less, to patterns in your mind, and then the patterns become cues, so triggers that initiate something else. Then you have formalized patterns in a theory or in a carpet. I mean, the range of representations of patterns. Then you have your patterns of logic, of deduction, that brings you to a formulated decision or a project of a design, for example. So you have your formalized patterns here, and then, you have your patterns of logic and your patterns of design here, there. And then you have your patterns as habits, when you act, when you search, when you perform, let's say, and then you go and you modify the world again. So you have a permanent back and forth between decoding and encoding the patterns in the world, the patterns in your minds, your patterns as formalizations, and your patterns as possibly, if this is what you use, guides for design when they are explicit. And this recursively shapes our thoughts and actions, our social worlds, and the systems or designs that are in the world and may take a life of their own, so the medium or the social system that has its own cognition or things like that. So, I think, until what time, Martha?
We have like 15 minutes or 20.
Okay. So I'll be very brief. So I wanted to look at Jung a little bit because the different mental functions about introversion, extroversions, the orientation of our energy and attention, whether we have more of abstract, so intuition-based perceiving function or sensed concrete based approach, thinking and feeling the way we make decisions and perceiving, judging, that probably could be connected to the ways we prefer making inferences as well. But the reason why I found this interesting is that these are also different poles of dualities that are interesting to connect, and maybe looking at the patterns that can express an external focus rather than internal focus, a subjective focus rather than an objective focus, and play in these ranges of dualities. So to make the story short, we can say that using patterns and putting patterns in the middle of a discussion as boundary objects that can be seen as, I don't remember if it was Yugita or Anne, as an object that is dispassionate, that doesn't have an identity like the system, that doesn't have specific values or things, but are just some configurations and movement and things that can be looked at in a reflexive, let's say, way, can help make distinctions, make connections or interface, mediate among and between, so inside and among, experience and scientific inquiry, the objects of study, whether we know them or not, the extrospective aspects and the introspective aspects, the subject, the observer, the designer, the worldviews and the practices.
Then somehow I absolutely lost the clue. So what is the link between these Jungian dimensions and what you are talking about now? Somehow I just can't...
Well, that's in the Jungian dimension.
So it has to do with the next slide, the one?
Well, this is my conclusions slide. Okay. So I'm saying that, in the Jung you have internal, external, subjective, objective, abstract, concrete.
And how you find it interesting in terms of pattern? That would be the inter-individual diversity between people, what they tend to perceive, or? For example,
or it can be a framework to look at, in a way where you're not situating people in these scales, but that you can look at situations or other types of things through this particular frame, which is pretty interesting in my view, and that I would like to see how it can apply to ontology, epistemology, and stuff like this here, this particular model, because we tend to look at it from the MBTI Myers-Briggs test, putting people in boxes type of approaches, but looking at it like this in a dialectic way could be interesting.
Yeah,
So experience, scientific inquiry, subjective, objective, different scales of observation, different scales of recursion. So helping probe, it's almost like your Lego, you're building, you're constructing, you're deconstructing. So instead of using systems dynamic simulations where you run something and it's already there and you can't change any parameters, then you can have a kind of modular way of simulating things in conversation in a way that can reveal differences, distinctions, similarities, different worldviews, etc. So a way to reproduce and externalize the way the brain works. So I had intended to apply this to a case, to a question, but I'm not sure we have enough time, but maybe we can discuss it. My question was, why and how do we need to change or improve the way we collectively think? And I wanted to identify different types of patterns, patterns of various levels, maybe we can take the 15 minutes that are left to talk about this question, but also also because it connects to the topic of the session in a free type of way, more than what I had initially.
What is meant by generative patterns, degenerative patterns?
Well, you have patterns that are good, ethically, let's say. I mean, that you have good patterns that, you know, create more abundance or that regenerate nature, and you have degenerative patterns that destroy, basically. Yeah, or pollution, or...
But pollution
you know,
is not a pattern.
Well, the behavior that consists of throwing out your toxins as an externality, as an organization, is a degenerative pattern. And so
I wouldn't call it a pattern, but an action, for example, or behavior. But a pattern is just a relation within an information, or within data, let's say it like this.
Yeah, but so maybe the difference here is that I put meaning into a pattern. So for me, a pattern is not like information in the Shannon sense of a packet of stuff that is processed or computed either by the brain or by a computer, but more something that has a structure, a direction, and performs a function. So it's more of a, maybe the, let's say the mirror of a system in its visible behavior. That can be argued, but that's the way.
I think if I go to this issue of pollution, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's not, this is the way things are. There is a mental model, there is an accepted model that goes with it, that starts from the perception of the system as closed, and it has an input that it has legitimacy to take from wherever it takes it, and it has an output that it has legitimacy to throw wherever it throws.
It assumes
on the idea that there is a very, very wide environment that can absorb and provide. Okay.
Yeah,
now,
I mean, I'm absolutely with you, but I think I would call it an argument.
Yes, I just want to finish. You can see a very different kind of structure, which is a pattern, which, for example, says that whatever is producing something must do it within a cycle, which means that you need to be circularizing in some fashion both the input and the output. Now, you changed from something that it's linear and it's where the relevancy is within the system, and everything which is on the line outside of the system does not stand in the same relevancy, to a different kind of model that applies a cycle, and everything has to be the same sort of relevancy. These are patterns, very wide patterns, but they're patterns. And they are culturally accepted. And this is why the organization or the production line can operate the way it does. It comes from somewhere in a worldview. It is applied and accepted and legitimated culturally, and then it is inscribed, and this is the way we do things, or this is the way things are. This is a very, very wide pattern, which is legitimated culturally. And it comes from a worldview that has to do with how we perceive systems, or the idea of things happening.
Thanks for the very detailed explanation, but as you said yourself, then it's a model, but not a pattern, at least in philosophy and mathematics. And informatics, that's not what you call a pattern. Maybe, I don't know in which, where are you exactly based, and maybe there you call it a pattern, but not in these disciplines.
Yeah, but we're trying to see if we can have a definition of a pattern that can cut across different disciplines. Well, maybe some things you don't in your area consider a pattern. But for example, I'll take another example that maybe probably you would consider a pattern is think of the finance system, and think of the finance system where every analyst says that the stock exchange is going to crash. What happens to the stock exchange? It crashes. Why? Because the actors are going to follow the information of the analysts who are projecting the crash of the finance system, and so it creates a kind of entrainment effect that the finance system is going to crash, it's going to crash. Or take Facebook and the network effect. So the network effect, you have, once you have a certain critical amount, threshold of people that are part of a network, well, everybody else comes because everybody is in it, and then you have a kind of snowball effect, or even more than a snowball effect mathematically, that creates this effect. What happens with venture capital firms, for example, is that they are going to buy themselves with zillions of financing. They're going to buy network effect and lose money for 10 years. They don't care because they have a monopoly, and you see the results today. So you have degenerative patterns. I mean, I didn't want to get into a good-bad discussion here, but more trying to see how we can look at patterns or take the pretext of patterns to peel the different dimensions of what we're looking at, and to understand what we're looking at, and to try and connect the different layers or dimensions of what we're looking at. Yes, Stefan? It's a pity we couldn't.
Two things. One is definition of pattern, and what this is a reflection on yesterday's discussion. It was a conversation about domain-specific language, translation of domain-specific language to pragmatic approaches. Just my personal, now very quick thinking was, if you would look for a definition of patterns that would, did you say cut through disciplines or bridge disciplines? I don't know what you used. But then it might get really confusing, because there is definitely, I think, a difference between the pattern, let's say from a cognitive science perspective, when we talk about pattern formation in the brain. Pattern is coming from structure. Now, very neutral speaking, structure can be different kinds of structures, of course, from a natural system to a social system. But I think then there is also a little bit of difference to patterns from behavior, which you call the social construct. And there is, of course, some, there is, of course, in each of these cases, body of knowledge around these perspectives. But there is a distinction between patterns in the mathematics and not in the philosophy, because philosophy is too broad maybe, but in the mathematics, to the patterns, let's say, in behavior coming from a social and social psychological. Yeah. There are, well, no. I was just saying, But you know, and now I'm coming to the next reflection in my brain is when we are forming this initiative. I don't call it a school, purposefully. When we are forming this initiative.
Anti-school.
Nah, maybe. I would be anarchist enough. But no, seriously, if we're forming this school and we want to have an interdisciplinary and then transdisciplinary conversation, I think we need to take into consideration and respect, as I said in former days, the different terminologies and worldviews, right? So not argue about, but this is also a pattern. But say, from a perspective of a social science research, and even the body of knowledge that stands behind it, it is a pattern stemming from behavior because, which is a difference to a pattern of mathematics, although there is one thing that is similar, and that is repetition, right? Maybe you can agree on that, I don't know. But something like this.
I have a proposition.
I'm just thinking aloud about how we can
deal with differences.
And I am not doing that because of what I'm thinking now, but also because I did a maybe 2 years project on transdisciplinarity, where the researchers agreed at the end of it that transdisciplinarity means not dissolving the disciplinary views. Not about no. But about enhancing disciplinary views, strengthening even disciplinary views by giving the ability to communicate across. But this does not mean, as not dissolving, this does not mean that there is now a new definition of anything that is now the substitute of all that has been before, because this is the transdisciplinary definition of it.
That's a better language.
I want to show you something.
I agree.
I can.
Yeah? Do you find the idea?
I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah.
I think that Helene is right. When we start in a very fundamental way to think about patterns, yeah, we can emulate systems of different forms and sorts and kinds. Yeah, I can try to show. Is this okay with you?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, because I think that simply make the point.
Want this?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So, because Helene talked about Facebook, and I can show you how an emulation of the fundamental conflict of Facebook, yeah, looks like. The fundamental conflict of Facebook we can see as, look at me, no, look at me, no, look at me, no, look at me. It's always this, yeah, it's a pattern, all the time. And when we emulate this pattern with our logic of cognition, it looks this way. It's going further and further and further and further, and it's always self-redundant, it's always self-organizing, it's not very smart, it looks colorful, yeah, but it's from the first line, initiated, randomized, it's always bringing forth the same pattern, the same, and it's fragmentizing more and more and more and more. This can run indefinitely. In the end, the fragmentation will lead to a point where the whole thing implodes, and then it starts again. Yeah. So what you say, it depends on where we start. When we start with very, very fundamental forms, yeah, we can see that the patterns we observe in reality and real life systems are fundamentally the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But this is one-dimension cellular automata.
well, we'll talk
I
about.
will show this to you later. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just simply wanted to make this visible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
that we
just
can see
wanted
what's
to ask
happening.
Rolf, so you think that pattern thinking is not, I mean, what's your...
I don't have any opinion about pattern thinking yet. Well, I mean, we are thinking in patterns all the time, but to use it as a new solution. But I wouldn't call behavior and system processes and so on as patterns, because if we do this, then everything is included, and then we are missing clarity. For me, I think it's much better if we use the term pattern just for mathematical patterns, and for the other processes, behaviors, and models, and theories, and so on, we use these terms.
Yeah, but in my mind, for example, I use pattern, and I'm not saying that, you know, but I use pattern in totally different way.
Yeah.
It's not mathematical. It's just, you know, somehow based in my domain, and I'm not using it. I'm not overusing it. You know, I use it from time to time. Say, oh, that's the pattern, but it's not my basic, you know, the methodology or whatever. But you know, for me, I'm very, very far away from how it's understood in mathematics. So I think that your question, you know, how to remain, how to stay, how to respect what was done and how it's understood in one domain, and then somehow see how it could be, I don't know, translated or differentiate. Because, you know, if you say that pattern is ours, a pattern is something that belongs to the discipline, then we have the issue, because for me the pattern belongs somewhere else. Not we, but I think we, you know, in terms of what...
Yesterday, Rolf, you said an observation, and then you said, here's a pattern. So if you observe a behavior, and you can name it, and you can categorize it,
No, it's the other way around. You have your stream of consciousness, for example, or your experiences, and within these experiences you detect a certain pattern. This means a certain repetition, for example.
Yeah, but it can be a behavior as well. So
it becomes a behavior on a higher level then, but this is already an abstraction.
But not if your behavior is what you observe, or what you detect, or what you perceive. In a system, or in yourself, or in, and that's when it becomes, it's at the observation, it's at the observation of the experience level. That's why I was surprised that we weren't speaking of the same, thing. Yes, Anne, what were you saying? And
I think this is a discussion that I come across very often when we're talking about different paradigms. We're talking about language within a discipline. Or you're talking about language in a transdisciplinary, you know, in a more holistic approach. We sort of have to use the same language, because otherwise people will say you're talking Chinese to me. So we use the same words, and then the trap is that people will define those words in their minds. We had the same discussion on objectives or goals yesterday. If in the old system, goal is a linear process, whereas in systems thinking, goal is what sort of like steers behavior of a system. So you use the same word, but the connotations are totally different, and that is a difficulty that you come across all the time when you talk about paradigm shift. So just to say there's nothing dramatic about it, it's just part of what we have to sort of. And what I usually do is use visualization to show that you know, like for example, I use the four drivers, the four rotor blades of transition, with the RI, and you can use patterns on every, you know, the term patterns may appear on all of the four, but you also have to recognize it on the.
But I liked your thing of yesterday, because it really shows at where we are situated, at the level of what we perceive, probably differently.
Time to finish.
So I'd like just to put during the 10-minute break. Oh, you want to wrap to...
No. I just wanted to say that it's time to...
So
it's time for coffee. We'll take a 10 minutes break, okay? 10 minutes, so we meet at 10:35.
Picture is better.
Yeah, but then I'd like to keep